6.04 Songhai, Benin, and the New Slave Trade. This goes along with your Human Odyssey reading pages 262 to 271 and your student guide pages 166 to 169. Lesson Introduction. Class of Civilizations. Powerful trading kingdoms had thrived in Western Africa for centuries before the Portuguese arrived in the late 15th century. The kingdoms of Songhai and Benin had grown prosperous by selling gold, copper, koala nuts, and slaves to merchants from north of the Sahara. When Europeans arrived, the slave trade increased. Europeans were eager to ship slaves across the Atlantic to replace the declining native populations in the Americas. Over the course of 300 years, millions of enslaved Africans made the so-called Middle Passage to the Americas, suffering terrible deprivation, abuse, overwork, and humiliation. Lesson Objectives. Many of these objectives are covered in detail in the readings from your Human Odyssey book, pages 262 to 271. Describe the change that took place in the African slave trade in the 1500s. Describe the culture and government of Benin. Describe the Middle Passage and the toll it took on people. Describe the savanna and the rainforest. Explain the origins and nature of the Portuguese slave trade. Identify on a map the major cities and geographical features of Songhai and Benin. Identify the major events and people in the history of Songhai. Recognize that slavery had existed for thousands of years in many parts of the world before the 1500s. And recognize that the people in the African kingdoms identified themselves with members of their own tribe, not with the inhabitants of the entire continent. This is in your student guide, page 166. This is required, not optional. You will need to take some time to fill in this map. You can use your book, or you can fill it in using this page here. Please make sure you understand where these parts are in Africa. Slavery. By the time Europeans began the transatlantic slave trade in the 1500s, slavery had existed in many parts of the world for thousands of years previously. Slavery existed in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Aztec Empire, and in Africa, with the African slave trade to the Muslim world. African Kingdom of Songhai. The capital of the African Kingdom of Songhai was Gyao, which was located on the bend of the Niger River. Around the year 1000, Songhai's leader converted to Islam, but most of the people continued to worship the old Songhai gods or followed Songhai's old religion. In the 1300s, Mali was the neighboring empire that captured much of Songhai. Sunni Ali, the Songhai ruler, conquered Mali and destroyed the famed city of Timbuktu. During the reign of Askia Muhammad, the Songhai Empire reached its greatest size. Benin. Benin is the African kingdom known for its skilled brass makers and its well-organized capital. The all-powerful ruler of Benin was known as the Aba. Geographic terms. Savanna is a vast grassy plain with a few scattered trees. In Africa, there is one south of the Sahara. Rainforest, a dense, wet woodland filled with gigantic trees. It is home to many different types of animals. Transatlantic slave trade. Merchants from the European country Benin started the transatlantic slave trade by buying slaves from the king of Benin. Spain and Portugal were the first European countries to use African slaves to work in their American colonies. The slave trade grew when the Portuguese began to grow sugar in Brazil. The Portuguese did not continue the trans-Saharan transportation of slaves to the Muslim world. African slavers, those who sold enslaved people. When African slavers sold slaves to the Europeans, they did not believe that they were selling their own people into slavery because they thought of themselves in terms of tribal groups, such as Edo or Songhai, not as Africans. Sorry, there's a quick typo there. There we go. African slaves were thought to be needed in the Americas to replace the rapidly declining population of native people. European nations that eventually engaged in the transatlantic slave trade were Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands. And then the Middle Passage is the name given to the second leg of the three-way trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And finally, the transatlantic slave trade involved millions of African slaves over the course of 300 years. How did the European colonization of the Americas end up affecting the population of 3 different continents? Colonization of the Americas devastated the Native American population. It led to the displacement of millions of slaves from Africa. It also led to the migration of tens of millions of mostly poor Europeans. And there we come to the end. Let your past make you better, not bitter.